Well, thank you for joining us for today's UAB's Oral History Collection. As a history nut of sorts, I'm looking forward to learning more about Birmingham and the history of Alabama through this. I'm Greg Berry, Assistant Director in the UAB Office of Alumni Affairs. As is the case with any virtual event, please excuse any glitches that may happen. If you experience video or audio issues, click the reconnect button at the top of your screen. This will get you back to the webinar right away. Tonight, we welcome social sciences librarian Brooke Becker. Brooke is an associate professor and reference librarian for social sciences and communication studies here at UAB. She has been part of the UAB family since joining the university in 2003. Brooke earned her Bachelor of Arts in History and Political Science from Samford University in 1998 and obtained her Master of Library and Information Science from the University of Alabama in 2002. At this time, I would like to welcome Brooke Becker and turn things over to you. Brooke, so nice to have you tonight.
Hello, everyone. So nice to be here.
Good to have you.
All right, so welcome, everyone. Tonight I want to tell you a little bit about our Oral Histories collection. This is one of my favorite things that we have. It's one of my favorite things to talk about. So let's get started. So first things first, yes, I am a Birmingham native, and yes, I am occasionally very enthusiastic about not only Birmingham, the city, where we've been, where we're going, but also our collections that really look at Birmingham and tell of the breadth and the depth that there is in Birmingham. So I want to begin with a somewhat obvious acknowledgement for me. I am not the absolute expert in all things UAB and Birmingham. Certainly that honor goes to Tim Pennycuff, who is our UAB archivist and really one of the smartest people I know. So I just had to go ahead and start off by giving him a big hoorah. All of the things that I'm going to be talking about tonight are actually physically housed in the UAB Archives. So let's begin. So when you're talking about Birmingham, there's so much history involved in the city that was incorporated in 1871. So much that has happened, so many ups and downs in our city's history. Here are a lot of things that people think about when they think of Birmingham. Greek history, Birmingham, obviously civil rights is a huge one. Tennessee coal and iron, Sloss Furnaces, healthcare, etc. Tonight, I want to specifically talk about the UAB Oral Histories. Now, this is one particular collection. We have a couple. And the collection that I'm going to be speaking about tonight actually came to us, excuse me. It came to us, interestingly enough, after the Oral History Office closed. The collection includes interviews recorded between 1975 and 1984. They were under the direction of the Oral History Office, which was in the Department of History at what was then the University of Alabama in Birmingham. In case any of you actually think that that was that's a typo. No. It was then University of Alabama in Birmingham. The records were taken through professional interviews, through student interviews. They often had papers that were connected to them. They were fairly frequently taken on audio cassette. And the purpose of the Oral History Office itself was to collect, to preserve, and to make available the oral memoirs of prominent persons who have contributed significantly to all phases of recent Alabama history. Now, with that said, this collection is not just about prominent people. There are all walks of life included in this collection, but that was their stated goal. So how did we get access to them? Well, the old rumor used to be that we kind of scrounged them as in like a going out of business sale as soon as the oral history office closed, but it was actually a little bit more formal than that. We gathered them. They were donated from the oral history office in the history department. We got access to the transcripts of those oral histories, to any audio recordings that still existed. We got access to any supplemental materials. So if it had a release form, say, yes, you can use my my interview for the media, for your research, for anything. You know, if it had a release form with it, we got those as well. Some didn't, but we got everything that they had. So for many years, we had these in our special collections in Stern Library. They were print. They were accessible. If you made an appointment, you could come in and look at them, but not a ton of people knew about them. They were kind of our hidden gem, or at least to me, they were our hidden gem. Then several years later, a couple of the catalogers and other librarians started trying to find a way to preserve these materials, knowing how important they were going to be. So with grant funds and some other things, they had all of the transcripts or all of the audio cassettes that we had available. They had all of those transferred to CD-ROM. Trying as much as we can to preserve, and then also to make them a little bit more available. Some of the cassettes were really not in great condition. You can hear it in some of our audio, some of the real scratchiness of those cassette tapes, and they were trying desperately to preserve them. I've got a shout out here to Patty Pilkerton and Carolyn Walden, who were very heavily involved in that. They have now since retired and are hopefully very much enjoying retirement because they worked very hard when they were with us. From there, it took several years again, but once more we started thinking, okay, not only do we need to preserve these, we need to get these more out into the hands of researchers, not just those who are here at UAB, not just students that have had a class with us or, you know, something along those lines, who've heard about all the fabulous stories that are in our collection, but we want researchers outside of UAB to have access to them without actually having to come if they're not able to. So through, I like to say through magic, but it's definitely not like magic, through a lot of hard work and the help of our archives, our digital works staff. I have a thank you to Kelly Schiff, who helped digitize most, if not all, of those transcripts and documents and whatnot. But we eventually digitized all of the transcripts, the supplemental materials, all those release forms that we had, and we built a website and put them on the internet, or what we lovingly then called the World Wide Web. Yes, we were old. So all of that is really neat, and that's cool. But what do we have? I can understand, and thanks for asking. We have so much in this collection. In addition to the works that we got from the Oral History Office, which are things on civil and political leaders in Alabama and Birmingham, we have a lot of things on civil rights struggle in Alabama, both pre and post Board versus Brown. We have several things talking about the Depression impression on people's lives in Alabama, both women and men, on families, on jobs. We also have several things involved with education in the state. Several of those deal with integrating schools. We have some delightful ethnic histories of different groups in Birmingham. As you saw on that thought bubble earlier on, the Greek community is definitely represented in one or two of our oral histories. I'll be showing you a little clip later on from one of those. But we also have Russian and Italian and a few others. We also have histories, folk histories from different areas. We have one dealing with Gee's Bend and Bear Creek. And then we have several on women's history, definitely women's suffrage. Some of my favorites are the ones dealing with women's suffrage. And then one or two dealing with military experiences. But right there in the center, you see one section that didn't really come along with the initial transfer, and those are the industrial workers in mining in Alabama. Several of these came with a transfer from the Sloss Furnaces Foundation, and it's a large number of Sloss Furnace workers who gave interviews during that same time period, and those have all been combined into one large oral history collection. There's some fascinating things in there, such as this is my favorite thing that I have ever found in all of our oral histories. This is Mrs. Ruby Folsom Ellis Austin, and yes, all of that is in there. She would be the first to point out to you that she was not named Ruby. Her name was Rachel, but she picked up the name Ruby when she was younger and never lost it. But in her listing of the things that she talks about in this oral history is, yes, you see that star there, UFOs. You're not, it's not a mistype. She has a lovely story about seeing, about witnessing an actual UFO and how it landed, and how she wished that they had come out to greet her, but they did not. And she was very disappointed about that. She really wanted to get on the ship and just talk to them. But yeah, so that is one of the quirky things that you can find in here. You go in looking at something like this, and you see the name Folsom in her name. She was, in fact, the sister to Big Jim Folsom, and she was the mother to George Wallace's second wife, Cornelia, or Cornelia, as she was often pronounced. So she had a very interesting history and was very involved in a lot of politics in this state in and of itself. As you can see, campaigned with Jim Folsom and Cornelia and George Wallace. But right there, she also talks about UFOs and pierced ears. You never know what you're going to find sometimes. So moving forward, what I want to do is give you a little bit of insight into some of my favorite interviews, some that really have stood out to me over the years, some for personal reasons and some just because I really, really find them interesting. The first one that I wanted to show you tonight is one of the histories that we have is from A.G. Gaston. Now, I hope that all of you know who A.G. Gaston is. If not, let me give you a little bit of background. A.G. Gaston was born very poor. His mother was a day laborer, and he was sent to a poor school, or Tuggle Institute, which was primarily for students who were on the poor side or those who came from the juvenile justice system were also occasionally sent to the Tuggle Institute. He rose up through the ranks. He worked in the mines. He worked in in coal mines, worked in several different areas, but he began to build up businesses. And by the time that I met him in high school, he was a millionaire, probably multi-millionaire by that point. He had essentially an empire that he had built. If you ever have noticed A.G. Gaston Motel or A.G. Gaston Radio, he had an insurance company. He had a mortuary. So all of these things he built up. And then he was also pretty influential in the funding of several different civil rights activities and whatnot. But he is definitely one of my more interesting stories one of the more interesting stories of Birmingham and certainly of Alabama is the story of A.G. Gaston. I highly recommend that you go and check out everything that you can find on him. I pulled out a couple of things from from the transcript of his oral interview. The first is he's talking about Mrs. Tuggle, who ran the Tuggle Institute, Carrie Tuggle. And I brought this one out because it actually introduced me into a fraternal society that I had not previously heard of. And I'm probably going to butcher the name, and forgive me if I do. But the Court of Calanth, I'd never heard of that one before. So I was pretty excited to see that. And as a former history major and as the social sciences librarian, I love finding little nuggets like this that I can tell students about, and then they can do more research. So I'm always really excited when I see things like this. But in this little snippet, he's talking about how the Tuggle Institute got their funding with very poor students. How did they keep going? And he tells of Carrie Tuggle fundraising, looking at people like Louis Pizitz. And if you've seen Pizitz around town, you know that that's a big name in the Birmingham area. Mrs. Orr, Brother Brian, who's also another big name in Alabama and Southern history. She would contact them and personally go and fundraise. So yeah, fundraising sadly is not a new thing for academic schools. But the one other thing right here is right there. She also knew when it says Judge Black, he's talking about Hugo Black, who was then on the Supreme Court and was very instrumental in several landmark cases that came out of the state. So I also pulled this out. And this is a picture of Mr. Gaston and one of his many buildings and parts of his empire. This one was particularly interesting to me because in it, the interview itself is not about the Klan, but the interviewer did a really good job about looking at all aspects of Mr. Gaston's life. And I thought that this thing that he said about the Klan was really quite interesting, because it then goes into, even though it's not in the list, it's not in the listing for his particular oral history, but he begins talking about the convict lease system and how people didn't really serve sentences in a prison. They were sold out to mines and working in the coal mines and things like that until they finished their sentence at the time. So he goes into a little bit more detail about that. And then down here, just his saying that was a terrible punishment for black men. The state would lease them out to the coal mines. I've seen some terrible things in this town. So just had to include that and then show you, even with that, how far he got. He was a really, really, really impressive gentleman. The next one up is a little bit different. It's a name that probably most people don't know, but this is one of our ethnic histories, or kind of community histories in the collection. This one is a discussion about the Greek community in Birmingham. Nicholas Christo was interviewed by actually somebody who may be in this webinar tonight. Sophia Petru, I think is her name. But his is really, really interesting as well. All of them are interesting. But his history is a little bit different than Mr. Gaston's. He was born in Greece and came over early in the 1910s. In 1912, he went to Ohio. He was sent to Ohio, sorry. He talks about that journey and what he had to go through to get into the country, to that at Ellis Island, he went through all of those, the checks that they have to go through, you know, the health check and whatnot. And then because he didn't speak much English or any English at all, he had to have an address that he was going to. And he couldn't necessarily always tell everybody, you know, this is where I'm going. So they put the address of the person that he was meeting in Ohio, put it on a sheet of paper and tagged it on his lapel so that everybody knew where he was going. And when he got off the train in Ohio, they knew where to direct him. So all of those little details are really fascinating to me. But in this, he also talks about what he did in Ohio. And I have to say that reading his transcript always makes me hungry because he talks about all the food that the Greek community was involved with in the city of Birmingham. And prior to that, opening this Cardington Candy Kitchen and Ice Cream Parlor. I can just imagine what it looked like. And he took it over from the person that he met in Ohio, who, as he says, he liked the old ideas, but he liked the new ideas. They didn't like having a candy kitchen in their drugstore. So he took it over and made a candy kitchen and ice cream parlor. So, oops. Secondly, he also talks about the Greek history in Birmingham, specifically about how the Greek community grew up, in essence, how they related to each other. This was pretty funny to me that at the time they were sort of at war, but obviously a non-violent war. But the two main church factions that were here at the time were always competing to get people into their different churches. And so as you see in the bottom of his little quote there, said they start getting mad and say, by golly, we're gonna put better buildings than they have. So it was really interesting to hear him describe the relations between the two churches and the two factions as declaring war on each other. Next up, we have a slightly different immigrant experience. Emilio Bacate is actually of Filipino descent, who was living in Vietnam during the Vietnam War. And he and his family at the time, his wife and his children were Vietnamese. They were rescued and sent. They left the country during the end of the conflict, as the communists were coming in and Saigon began to fall. They left in February, and then I think the final Saigon fall, which several of you hopefully many of you are familiar with the images of the helicopters on top of the State Department there, and people being loaded on. And they left a couple of months before that actually took place, but they thought that they were getting on a plane going to Guam because they wanted to go back to his home in the Philippines. Actually, what happened is that they were going to they were on the wrong plane, and it was no longer going to their destination. So they ended up in Guam instead of the Philippines, and in an American protectorate, and ended up not being able to go back home to the Philippines. So they immigrated to the U.S. and spent the rest of their lives as U.S. Became citizens and spent the rest of their life here. In this interview, he talks about the economic difficulties of the time, and gives a little bit of insight into, I think, what it was probably like to be, especially a new immigrant at the time. He talks about, because he's asked in this interview, he talks about some things that he saw that were not perfect in the United States. And then just at the bottom of this statement, he says, but generally Americans are, like I say, they're very good people and I can live with them as we have done so here. We are now fully integrated with the American community. So he's very careful, even though he's just been negative about some aspects of American life. He's very careful in this interview, and you can hear it when he's talking. He's very careful to make sure that the interviewer knows that he is grateful and that he considers themselves fully integrated and a working part of society. So another interesting things that you can find and suss out from these interviews. And then the last few that I wanted to share with you, probably most of you are familiar with Richard Harrington Jr. He was on the city council shortly after they changed over from a commission system. They went to a city council mayor system. He ran for the city council, and as one of the few African Americans on the council at the time, it was a vital role. He had been in that role for, I think, 7 years, maybe 6 years, when this interview was taken in 1977. And obviously that was a very important turning point of sorts for the city of Birmingham and for different communities. But in this, he talks about, the interviewer asked him several things about his life growing up, how he feels in the community. But this particular segment I thought was really interesting because he does talk about his political career, and he does talk about different aspects. But here he's really honing in on the fact that he really wants to be in government so that he can inform his community about what the government can do, so that he can be a channel for them to work through. And as you see at the very bottom, he says, I think that a part of a job of an elected official is to try to help educate people about how government works and how they can use it to their advantage, which I thought was really interesting to find in here. He talks about how they had, for so long, the Black community in Birmingham had felt like the government was against them, and the state government, the local government, and he wanted to be there as someone that could help them change that idea. Richard Arrington's, his is another one that's really, really interesting to listen to and to read. And then the final one that we have up is actually one of the first ones that I read and or listened to in our collection. And I have the picture up there of Ollies. If you are familiar with Ollies BBQ, there's so much more to that story. Ollie McClung Sr. and Jr. were part of what became a landmark case for civil rights in Birmingham and nationwide. The case was called Katzenbach v. McClung. And if you ever get a chance, I encourage you to go and read the case. But his interview, this is Junior, this is the son. They own the restaurant at the time that the 1964 Discrimination Act came out. They had Ollie's BBQ, and while they say that they never refused any black or white person food, or only white people essentially were allowed to sit in the restaurant. And Ollie McClung Jr. makes a big point in here that how unfair they considered the 1964 Act, and so they filed suit, and ultimately it went to the Supreme Court. They lost, and it opened up a lot of avenues for other civil rights legislation and other court cases, and it really turned a lot around in terms of businesses. Sorry, I just completely lost my train of thought. It completely turned things around for different aspects of people being served, of interstate commerce, and how that affected businesses, whether or not you could or could not refuse service to people. So what I liked about this in particular is towards the top of it, he's talking about how, this case was really all about government encroachment, and how they just didn't feel it was right that the federal government should have a say. And then right down here at the bottom, like in the same paragraph, he talks about government overreach is really why they did it. And then at the bottom is, to be perfectly honest, there was a specter of a mass influx of black people into our business, which would have driven white customers away. So in the same paragraph, he is saying two completely different things about why they actually filed their case. And I love that kind of juxtaposition. But those are just a few clips. I don't have that much. Didn't have that much time, so I couldn't show you all of the really amazing things. But just to name a few of the others that we have Margaret Burnett, who's talking about the women's suffrage movement, and how funny it was that she didn't really care if she got the vote or not, but her mama did, and how her mama came and told her that she had to go register to vote. And she was at work at the time, and her boss said, well, you got to do what your mama wants, so go register. And then she talks about how it later became important to her. Mamie Greer, who talks about integrating schools. Arthur Haynes, who talks about his various court cases. Erskine Hawkins, if you're a fan of jazz, you'll know Erskine Hawkins' name. It was a big name in the jazz movement. Nina Miglianico, was a civic leader in Birmingham, and her history is fascinating. And then, of course, I had to include Mervyn H. Stern, who is not just a building. He was a man in and of himself, and has quite a fascinating history of his own. So, you've had a small taste but there's always more to the story here. I really encourage you to go through the list that we have. Take your time, listen to the ones that are available. We do have some that are restricted, and that's only because when I was telling you about the paperwork that we got along with it, some of the oral histories didn't come with paperwork, and we have not been able to find a family member or whatnot to release those to the public. Some did come with paperwork, and on the paperwork it said close to the media. So we are hedging our bets and saying that anything internet related was probably along the lines of being closed to media. So please take a look at the list of oral histories, but definitely don't think that those are the only ones that we have. Those are just the big collection that I'm telling you about tonight. We also have close to 200 oral histories in the UAB Archives, separate from what I just talked about. Yet another treasure trove that we have in our collection. It was formed in '98 from different oral history projects, and they were conducted by different UAB personnel. And between 1985 and '95, it includes transcripts, a few bits of audio, maybe not as much, but it talks about administrators, medicine in Alabama, physicians, UAB, and definitely for all of those, contact the UAB Archives for access. So finally, in the future, what more would you like to know? I know there's so much more that you would like to know if you're anything like me, but let me know, and thank you so much for coming. Question?
And for all of our guests that have come into the webinar tonight, go ahead and drop what you're interested in learning about with the history in the chat box. We'd love to know, and that would help in future webinars as well. So I'll go ahead and kick the questions off. So how many collections does UAB have? Is it a vast library of these, or what's it look like?
In terms of the oral histories that I was talking about tonight, it's not a huge number, but they're really significant. And then we have, it's probably close to 200, those. And then we have the ones that I told you about at the end, the close to 200 that are in the UAB Archives. We have some that are in bits and pieces of other large collections, larger collections of other works of all kinds of different works and material. We also, those are all available to the alumni. We also have databases and whatnot full of primary sources, letters, diaries, oral histories, all kinds of things that we have on databases that we pay for. So unfortunately, those are not as accessible to anyone who's not a current UAB faculty, staff, or student, unfortunately. But we have a lot of different collections like that. In addition to our oral histories, go onto our website, and on the library's website, look under research, look under digital collections, and you're going to see a host of other massive collections that we've digitized. We have Florence Nightingale papers. We have a collection on the pellagra outbreak. So many things that we have that all of a sudden I'm completely blanking on. But we have lots of different World War I things, medical instruments that they've put up. So yeah, definitely go check all of those out, because they're pretty spectacular, and we love getting collections like those that we can really sink our teeth into, that are unique and that people want to seek out and learn from.
So when it comes to the age of some of these oral histories, part of the collection, just perusing quickly on that website, I noticed 1899. So how far back do these go, some of the oral histories? Do you know?
Well, now some of these, what you may be seeing on those oral histories are birth dates of
Okay.
some of the that the head of the history department might be on here, and other people who might be interested in this. But what I would love to see is some sort of oral history program again at UAB. We have ethnographic films that are created, but I would love to have another office of oral history and start collecting some of those things that we really haven't been in the last several years. Though we do have a really nice collection of COVID-19 oral histories that are in our archives. So those we just took place. But a little shout out to people who do these things. Can we do it again?
And I think, just the popularity and the interest of this is fantastic. So are the Beauregard and Pink Viking mascots in the archive somewhere? Please tell me they are.
I believe that they are. However, as I mentioned, I am not the UAB archivist. That is Tim. Tim Pennycuff is our guru. But yes, I believe that they are. And if Tim has anything to do with it, they are.
Okay. And are you still pursuing releases?
Yes. Yeah, we're not doing it as actively. We had a committee maybe 10 years ago that when we, sad to say, when we had a lot more time on our hands and a lot more people in the library, we had a committee that really had a big push for trying to find families or representatives or anything that could okay those releases. But if anybody's interested, if you look in one in that list and you see one that is restricted and you know somebody in that family, please let us know. We would love to get as much as we can out there and open. I mean, we're a library. We want everybody to have access to it.
And a lot of this is accessible for alumni.
Oh, yeah.
And we dropped that link in there. So Claire, go ahead and cut and paste, put that back up there just so they can see that. What percent of the collection is available for alumni to kind of take a look at and see?
I don't have a specific tally, but the vast majority of the ones that are up are available for anyone to look at. Alumni, researchers across the country. I actually, I won't say who, but I did have a researcher contact me recently who may or may not be a Pulitzer Prize winning author, Birmingham history, whatever. But she, oops, I'm so sorry. But she was interested in finding and using one of our oral histories for something new she was writing. So yeah, they're the large majority of the oral histories that we have digitized are available and accessible to anybody.
Obviously, what we talked about today was more about that window in time, mid 70s to mid 80s. We recently celebrated our 50th anniversary as a school, and during that, there were a lot of communications, a lot of interviews done, stories told. Have they been archived, the 50th
Yes.
anniversary? Okay, so where can people find those?
Those are also in the UAB Archives.
Okay.
Yeah, UAB Archives is your place to be, man. That's why I say that Tim is our guru.
And Tim is outstanding. We actually sat down with him when we launched our Green and Told podcast, and he shared kind of the history, the origins of UAB. Yeah. And it is a fascinating story. All of the history that we can get through the stories that you've shared, the stories that are still yet to be shared, just incredibly important to the history of the area, not just UAB, but Birmingham as well.
Yeah, the growth of Birmingham is so closely tied to UAB and UAB to the growth of Birmingham. Those two are really symbiotic in how they've related to each other. By the way, I'm sure many of you have it, but definitely check out Tim's book on the 50th anniversary of UAB.
Awesome.
It's definitely worth it.
Well, Brooke, thank you so much for being a part of this evening and sharing the brief oral history that you did. And it was very fascinating, very enjoyable to listen to.
Yeah, I could talk for several more hours, but some of us probably need to go to bed.
Well, thanks again. And for everybody who did attend tonight, we will have a recording of the webinar available on our website starting tomorrow morning. If you're looking to get out and enjoy the weather, join us April 23rd through April 26th for our virtual scholarship run presented by Viva Health. We have a 5K, 10K, and for those that really don't want to run, we have a I can't even speak. We have a non-running option. So basically something for everyone. Registration is only $35. You're supporting student scholarships here at UAB. You can register at alumni.uab.edu/run. Be sure to check out other upcoming webinars. On Wednesday, April 14th, we will host Build Your Personal Brand as Sam Miller, Vice President at Burden Advertising, shows us how our brand can help us stand out in a crowd. Then on Thursday, April 22nd, we'll explore what the latest science has to say about living longer, healthier lives. And on Thursday, May 20th, join us for the arts as a tool for healing and wellness. Through this webinar, we will discover how the arts can enhance health during a hospital stay. You can find out more about all of these webinars, register for them at alumni.uab.edu/events. If you're looking for a podcast, if you want to listen back to that Tim Pennycuff episode, we've got one for you on during your day, on your commute, whatever. Check out UAB Green and Told. Our podcast features members of the UAB community, and we release it every other week. You can find it on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, many other places, or you can just visit alumni.uab.edu/Green and Told. You can also stay on top of everything alumni on social media. Just search UAB Alumni on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. On LinkedIn, search UAB Alumni Career Community. Need to get a hold of us? It's easy. Email alumni@uab.edu. Once again, thanks for joining us for tonight's discussion with Brooke Becker. Have a great evening, and as always, go Blazers.
Go Blazers.